After e4, c6, then white can play the two knights against the Caro-Kann. So d5 comes, and now knight f3. In this video, I'm going to go through bishop g4, and what happens next, h3. So that's the next move we're going to play. We're immediately asking a question to this bishop, and I'm going to go through the bishop h5 variation in this video. There's plenty of other options available, like especially like bishop takes, and then there's going to be knight f6, e6. There's so much stuff, but we'll go through everything in the next videos. So after bishop h5, what's the move here? Well, now we have a few forced moves that can allow us to predict what black will have to do. So now we're going to play, for example, pawn takes. So that's the move. And now black will have to take back. Of course, not with the queen, the knight is protecting, or rather with the pawn. Bishop takes here is not good because we will take back queen, and we are controlling the square d5 even further. So then we'll be up material. After pawn takes back, now we play another forced move, which is g4, right? Now there's only one move available for the black player. He's not gonna be able to play bishop g4, of course, so bishop g6. And now, what's the move now? Knight e5. The idea here is to take the bishop and break the pawn structure of our opponent. Now, of course, it also depends on what black does. There's lots of options available for black. So let's see what happens after the first line we're going to go through is knight to c6. Okay, so just to make an example, the next move is d4. So we're going to keep the pawn in d4 and protect the knight in e5. This is a great thing to do now, because if knight were to take the knight, we'd be able to have a pawn in e5, which will stop the natural development of this knight into f6. Will not be possible. So let's just see it as an example. This is not the main move, but let's just see it very quickly as an example. Knight takes, pawn takes. Now it seems like black has been also able to preserve the bishop pair, but the thing is, now we have a massive threat, right? The threat is this: bishop e5 winning the game, because black will have to block it with the queen and then we'll take it. So how does black stop that threat? Well, black will have to play a6. That is the only way, or any other queen move. But anyway, whatever black does, white will be able to win this pawn. So a6, and now simply queen d5, and white is much better already, especially with this threat. And white doesn't have to worry about the c2 pawn because he's got an attack in here. And in case of queen takes queen, then knight here, we're threatening something more as well. So the black player would not be able to equalize material. So what if black defends it with this pawn? Right, this is even worse, e6, because then bishop e5 comes, and then only move is king e7, and now white continues with bishop e3. The idea is to win the game with bishop c5. Well, the only ways to try and stop this is either queen c7 or b6, putting control over the square c5. If black plays b6, white plays queen e2, and the idea is to play f4, f5, f6. And believe it or not, that's actually unstoppable. Anything that black will do will make the situation worse. So let's say, for example, black plays rook to c8. Oh, and by the way, this fork of pawn to d4 could have been met by long castle, for example, and then the pawn will be pained since we will be attacking the queen, and then there will be double attack on the pawn. Anyway, after a move like rook c8, white plays f4. Now the idea is to play f5, and if pawn takes, then we've got bishop g5, which wins the queen. And if black plays the f6 pawn, then we can take it with check, and it's a disaster. So after rook c8, f4, black might try to play something like f5. Now we can take en passant, and after black takes back, we still play f5. And we've got the same threats. Well, we're attacking the bishop, and we're about to open the lines here by taking the pawn. If the pawn were to take, then, well, here I guess even bishop b6 should be just fine. So here we are again. After, in the variation knight takes e5, then pawn takes back, we have this incredible threat. And if met by e6, bishop e5, king e7, then we have bishop e3 threatening c5. And if black blocks it, let's say with queen c7, then we've got knight d5. So that's a check. It's attacking the king and the queen. Black will have to take it. And now queen to d5. The threat is still there. This is going to win the game immediately. So bishop c5, and there's nothing that black can do to stop it. Okay, a move like queen a5 check, and white just plays king to d1, protects the pawn, and he's got nothing to worry. Alright, let's go back a few moves. So here in the starting position, when black just played bishop g4, we attack it, and after bishop h5, we take the pawn, pawn takes, and now we play another forcing move, which is dg4, bishop g6, and now knight e5. So let's keep going to the knight c6 move, and now we play d4, but this time let's go through not knight takes, because it's not good, but e6. Right? This is a much more normal looking move. And this now allows white to go for the usual pattern that happens against the Caro-Kann in this variation when black goes back to to h5 with the bishop. Now we play h4. The idea is to trap the bishop with h5, and there's no square, any square where the black bishop can go to. There's this one, but as we saw before, bishop e4 is met by f3, and so black will lose a piece. So now we play h4 and we're threatening to win a piece. So what does black do? Let's say black plays f6. We still play h5, and black will have to move the bishop. If black takes the knight, gives us the bishop, then this is coming with a tremendous attack. We're threatening now to play rook h7 and win the rook. If the rook takes our rook in h7, we can take back with the pawn, and it's gonna be game over for black. And so if black plays something like this king looks just horrible. And also we can take this pawn in e5, and black's position is terrible. He cannot develop this knight. Not even knight to e7 makes much sense because f5 is taken. This rook will never be able to develop. The only good pieces will be maybe this bishop, this queen, but white's development is ready to go in a minute. So let's say, but if black takes, then f4 comes, and the idea is to open the files, of course. If black were to return to c6, then simply queen e2, putting pressure on the e6 square, and after queen e7, defending the pawn, bishop d2. It looks like the black player will be able to save himself through castling, also because he will never be able to castle kingside, considering how these three pieces look like. After long castle and long castle, the black player was able to find some safety for the king, but the problem of the weakness caused by this g6 pawn will be seen soon. In fact, the black player cannot develop anything, and well, the black player cannot move the queen anywhere away from this e6 pawn. He cannot develop the bishop, and neither this rook. And white is threatening to just play g5, which this is preventing the developing of the knight. And if knight tries to go to g5 to f6 first, then after a move like king b1, black is paralyzed. That is the thing about it. Yeah, a move like knight d4 is carrying no one because the queen can just move away and the knight will be losing in there. So after this move, queen d3 saves the queen, attacks the knight again. So now the knight will have to move again. So it didn't really make much sense. And of course, it doesn't make sense for black to just go and defend the knight with the queen, even because of bishop e3. So after knight goes back, now white can finally play the move we were waiting for, which is g5. So this is the thematic in this specific variation of the Caro-Kann. When you got this pawn in here, it doesn't happen that much, but when black actually plays like that, you've got to punish it. So in this variation, we're going to punish the fact that black had to play defensive to defend the e6 pawn, and this pawn here is pinned. So after g5, the knight will have to move, or well, if pawn takes, then we can take this rook. If the knight moves, let's say e4, then we can just take it, we can win a pawn, and we're completely winning. And if the knight moves to d7, for example, then we just play bishop g2. And white's position is something like, I think evaluated something about like plus 4.50 or something. So it's extremely pleasant, right? There's nothing that black can move. None of these knights can move anywhere, and the queen is paralyzed, and white's got the bishop pair, so I think we can stop this here. If black desperately tries to keep attacking the queen, like knight to c5, then we exploit the fact we have greater freedom and the game is open. We've got the two bishops, we can play queen h3, still doing the exact same thing, putting more pressure on that pawn. Rook e1 is coming, still pinning this pawn as well. And yeah, let's go to the next line. So here we are at the starting position. After knight c6, white plays d4, and after e6, h4. So that's with the immediate threat. After black responds with f6, we play h5, and let's just quickly look at another variation from the same line as before. If pawn takes knight, then we take the bishop, and after h6, now we can take this pawn, and after knight takes, we play f4 as we've seen all of this. But what if black goes and take the pawn in g6? Then we've got a check here, and after king to f7, we go for the same pattern, f5. Black's position is falling apart. After the swap of pawn, and the white player may even afford a castle, the infiltration on the queen in d5 is potentially available, and so that's actually the worst line for black. So we're going to stop it there. So here we are again. After f6, black plays h5. What happens after bishop to f7? Now we take the bishop. King takes back, obviously. And now white plays a3. It's important not to get this knight pinned. We're going to need to use it. So now black has to go on with development. So let's say a move like bishop d6. Completely normal move in this situation. You don't need to play bishop e6. It's too passive. You might want to be able to get your knight there. And also queen potentially. And there's no reason not to make this bishop more active. Now white plays bishop e3. The idea is to play knight to b5 with an attack on the bishop and trade it for that bishop whilst keeping a nice pawn structure. That's why we didn't like the bishop going to b4 and taking our knight. So now there's different moves that can be played. So I'm just going to go through the main ideas and then we're going to continue with the next lines. Since white is threatening knight to b5, so let's say black plays something like a6. Just to make an example, it doesn't really matter too much. Now white carries on with the plan, which is queen f3. We're going to exploit the fact that this king is weaker and he hasn't castled. He's not going to be able to castle. So after queen f3, the goal now is to play long castle and then a move like g5. Right? This is going to help. This is going to make white's position amazing. So let's say black develops the knight, goes to e7. It makes perfect sense to think that white can already play g5, exploiting the pin. Now it would be great to just take, and maybe even bishop g5. And usually when I'm going through a line and I see that the advantage is +3, +4, and I understand the ideas behind it, and I see the goal of the pieces, then of course it's enough. There's no need to look at the million possible moves. So this is now something. Okay, let's just mention very quickly some potential ideas here. After g5, what happens if black plays f5, for example, tries to block everything? Then bishop comes to d3. The goal is still the same, long castle, and then we're going to play something like knight e2. So let's say long castle, knight e2, bishop f4, and we get a trade with probably the strongest minor piece that black has right now. And then later we play moves like rook d to e1, and yeah, the position is just very pleasant. So as I said, it's going to be impossible to look at everything that black can do, but those are the moves that are more likely to happen. And with an advantage of something like +4, I think we can all just continue to enjoy this weak king and the paralyzed black pieces. One very last thing I gotta mention is that after f6 and h5, black can play bishop e4, and that comes with an attack on the rook whilst the pawn is attacking the knight, so it looks interesting. But now white can just play knight takes e6. It comes with an attack on the queen. It cannot be ignored, so the pawn will have to take back. And now we play f3. So the bishop is trapped. That's one of the patterns that has to be remembered. One of the many patterns that has to be remembered about the Caro-Kann. After e4, c6, and then the usual moves, we got knight f3 and bishop g4. Now we attack the bishop immediately. Bishop h5, and we take the pawn. Pawn takes back, we play g4, forcing move, the only move available, bishop g6, and knight e5. One of the options here is to play a6, which stops this annoying bishop e5 check. So let's just look at the patterns here, right? I'm not saying that a6 will necessarily happen, but it is a move that stopped this idea. So how are we going to be able to develop this bishop? Well, first of all, now the move is the usual one, which is h4. It threatens to win the bishop next move. So if black plays something like h6, in this case, black is trying to get to h7 with the bishop, which is going to be safe for the moment. Well, white gets what it wants, because the idea was to take this bishop, right? But we didn't want to take the bishop when he could have been taken back by the h-pawn, because that would have made a stronger rook. And so knight takes bishop now is fine, because black will have to take it back like this. And it's giving the same problems of inactivity as before. This bishop will not be able to develop, this rook neither. So after that move, white plays d4. Now what are the ideas here? The idea is to play queen d3 with an attack on this pawn. So let's say black plays knight to c6, for example. White continues with queen to d3, attacking that square. And if black defends it with the king, then we have h5. We're still going for this pawn, and this is coming with a checkmate. So how can black stop it? It looks terrible. Black can play queen d6, right, to put more defense on g6. But now white plays knight to d5, and the queen will not be able to take the knight because of the threat of checkmate. So after a move like knight to f6, black is trying to create some space to go to. White can take the pawn, king goes back, and after swapping the knight in f6, white's got an incredible advantage and a very threatening position. Let's go back a few moves. After a move like queen d3, what if black plays immediately queen to d6 instead of king to f7 as we saw before? Now white continues with bishop to e3, so the queen is putting more defense over the g6 square. So what gives white such a good advantage at the moment is simply the fact that black pieces cannot move. Knight f6 will be met by queen winning a pawn in g6, and the position e6 will be met by the same thing. e5 is not possible because we can just take the pawn, and then we're going to have a double attack on d5. So black's best move now is the castle long side, and we have to do the same. Now we're going to have full control over this file. So a swap of pawns here like e5 will not be possible, because we will always have more advantage over this pawn in d5. And again, we're still threatening to take this pawn in g6, so black's position is just very stuck. This pawn, g5 is not possible because it just gets taken, the pawn is pinned. this bishop will not be able to develop to the fianchetto, so it will have to play e6, but then it will lose this pawn. So that's what gives white much better chances in the transition to the endgame. Right, back at the starting position after the knight e5 move, and we're just looking at this a6 variation. Right, so what's the move now? h4. We're going to try to trap the bishop. What if black plays h5 in this case, stopping the advance of the pawn? And well, of course we can't take, because then bishop takes back, comes with an attack on the queen, and we're achieving nothing. So what's the move now? Well, we know what to do when black plays the h-pawn. So yeah, we're not going to be able to memorize so many lines, of course, because it's impossible, but we know what to do when we see patterns which we have familiarized with. So what do we do when black plays the h-pawn? Well, we take the bishop, pawn takes back, and now white plays d4. The idea is the same, queen d3, queen g6. Also, one more thing we need to look at is how to start an attack on these two pawns. So after a move like queen d7, right, putting more pressure on g4, then we could play a move like pawn takes pawn. Well, pawn taking pawn would be terrible, because after bishop h3, there's going to be a full domination of the board by white. The black pieces will just never develop. Where does the queen go now? Well, wherever the queen goes to, we're going to put more attack on the d4 and the d5 pawn with the queen to f3. So let's say queen to d6, and we play queen to f3, we put in more attack on this square. This is a weak pawn, basically. Well, yeah, it can be defended by another pawn, that's true, but we're still attacking it, we're putting more pressure on that. And after this move, we can play bishop f4. The queen will have to move again in order not to lose the e6 pawn, and then we're going to castle. This position is insanely good for white. White has got everything developed, the bishop pair, and black has absolutely nothing developed. Not to mention we're making threats of knight e5 right now, rook e1, and so much more stuff. So back a few moves ago, if black takes back with the rook, then here what's the pattern like? We play bishop d3, threatening bishop g6, winning the game, and the rook will not be able to protect this pawn because we have another bishop on the dark squares. Right, back at the starting position after knight to e5, attacking the bishop, and a6. Now we play h4, and after h5, we take the bishop. Pawn takes back, and now d4. What happens after black plays a move like e6, trying to develop the bishop? And well, think about it. Like one of the things that has to be said about this black going into such a line is that he will not be able to castle anywhere safe. After a move like e6, now try to remember this pattern because we're gonna punish it immediately. Pawn can take the pawn in h5, and also we're threatening to take this pawn as well. And so let's say black will have to take back. If black takes back with the rook, then queen to g4 will do, because we're going to win this pawn, exploiting the fact that black's rook can't move. Also, we're attacking e6, and it's just too much pressure. What can black do to stop everything? Well, queen f6, protecting e6 and g6, is met by bishop g5. The rook will not be able to take because we can just take back. I mean, black will have to give up the exchange in order to decrease the attack of the white player, or move the queen away. So if queen f5, for example, desperately trying to swap, then queen e2, and now the threat of bishop h3 is unstoppable, and white will be winning quite a lot of material soon. Right, back a few moves ago, we went through rook h5 and then queen g4 move. What happens after pawn takes back? Again, the pattern is the same. Bishop to h3, attacking the weak pawn, and after queen e2, we will take that pawn no matter what. Not to mention the future fall of the d5 pawn. So white's much better here already. What happens after a move like queen takes pawn in h4, pinning this bishop? White just plays queen e2, simple as that. And threatens to go on, take e6, and then take d5, and create some real problem. The white king here has got absolutely nothing to worry. Black only has one piece, and that's not going to be enough to create problems. So after bishop h3 here, going back a move, what happens? Well, okay, queen f6, for example, just is not possible because of queen e2, same reason. White will be just absolutely fine here, while white will just win the pawn and potentially the other pawn, and so that's just not working. What happens after black plays knight to f6, maybe trying to speed up development? Black might realize that the pawn in e6 is lost no matter what and just develops the pieces. After bishop h3 here, we play queen e2, also because, well, if we take the pawn immediately, then queen d6 comes with an attack on the bishop, and black will have given away a pawn, but he will have some development, knight c6, and then the bishop will develop as well. The bishop in e6 will be forced to move away, and then I don't really like how this is going. So white plays queen e2 here. We'd rather enter in the e6 square with the queen, and maybe if black wants to swap pieces, then we can actually swap pieces and be up in material. After queen to d6 now, we keep developing. It's very important, because if black prioritizes development in order not to lose a pawn, we should not go for a pawn we should not chase after a pawn after we are done with development. Bishop g5, and now let's say this, I'm just playing the most developing moves possible. So knight b to d7, for example, defending the knight, and white now just castles long. And yeah, we've been able to take this free pawn for a long time, but we still haven't done it because it would have been too scary to actually do it, and also because this is how the pattern looked like, and now you know that this e6 pawn is just inevitably going to fall, right? It's impossible to be defended. So even after very developing moves like long castle, white still doesn't go for that pawn, but rather just plays this move. Those are the best moves, and those are also the moves I will play, but just because I know the pattern. I'm not going to deny that back in the days when I didn't know these lines and I saw this free pawn, I wouldn't have allowed the pawn to be like free for 1, 2, or 3 moves even. Eventually I will just take it, right? Because I'd be afraid that black will find a way to defend it. But because now we know for certain that this e6 pawn is a weakness forever, we just keep developing pieces. There's no reason not to. And now after a move like rook to e8, for example, then white keeps controlling the open file. We can play a move like rook to d3 now. We can play also f3. We will play rook e3 eventually and keep the advantage until the end. Although if you wanted to take the pawn in e6 before, there was nothing wrong with that. I was just showing the best moves in order to not get too greedy and just play principal chess. Right, let's recap. So the 2 knights and then knight f3, bishop g4, h3, bishop goes back, and then we take the pawn, they take back, g4, bishop g6, and knight e5. So what happens if black defends the bishop with the queen and says, okay, you're not going to mess up with my pawn structure? Now white continues with d4, also because we needed to protect the knight. And we're still threatening h5, h4, h5, and so on. So what happens after knight c6? Because the black player is thinking, okay, well, you know what, I'm gonna swap knights, and well, that's already a bad move because of bishop f4. And so the black's best move now is castle alongside, so that the rook will be protecting the d5 pawn. That is the best move according to the engine. Now the move is knight to b5, and now the queen will have to move. Well, the queen will not be able to stay on a dark square. Let's say, for example, queen b8, simply because we can just take the bishop in g6. The knight will be protecting our bishop, and this bishop will be targeting the queen. It's an absolute disaster. So black will have to stay, let's say, on this rank to protect the bishop and maybe even pin the knight in this case. Now white plays bishop e2, unpinning the knight and threatening knight takes e6, because what happens after knight takes e6? Well, if queen takes back, then knight a7 wins the queen and the game, and if the pawn takes back, then this is going to be terrible. This kick is going to be just terrible, and there's going to be plenty of ways to attack him successfully. Now the idea of the white player in this position after bishop e2 is to play c4 and a move like c4 and then queen to a4, right, going for this weak pawn. So that's how we're going to proceed, but it also depends on what black does. So for example, after a6 to attack the knight and get rid of the knight immediately, then white can play knight to c6. This is a tactic that appears in this pattern because black's king is so weak. So well, where does the queen go? Let's say queen to d6, for example. Now white can just take the pawn in a6 and the position of the black player is falling apart. Well, of course, this pawn will not be able to take the knight back because of bishop takes back, and then the king will end up on the same diagonal of the bishop. So knight moving away will allow the bishop to pin, or even knight just take the knight here, the bishop will be pinning the queen. So going back a few moves, after a move like a6, we punish it with knight c7. And what happens if the king takes? Then simply knight to g6, and white will be up in material. There's an attack on the rook, there's check on the king here, and that's even easier. Right, here we are at the starting position. After knight e5 and queen d6, we play d4, protecting the knight. And now after knight c6, we're already so much better by playing bishop f4, as we saw before. So what happens if black doesn't want to go through all of that trouble? Especially black can't push the e6 pawn because of knight g6, the knight's defending the bishop, and also there's a threat of h4, h5. So what happens if black just decides to try and swap everything? Knight takes e5. What's going to happen now? Black is thinking maybe after bishop takes, then queen b4, pinning the knight, attacking this pawn. Well, no, we take the pawn. We're attacking the queen. Where does the queen go to? Well, the queen cannot go to a light square because of bishop e5 winning the game. And also the queen will have to stick around this pawn because there's double attack on it. So after, what happens after queen e6 and the black player thinks, okay, if I swap everything in here, maybe eventually after castling, maybe I'll be attacking this pawn. A move like queen e6 is met by bishop to b5 check. So that was knight takes e5 here was a massive blunder. Bishop e5 check, king to d8, and now the knight goes to d5 and threatens a discovered attack. It's a disaster. So let's go back just a couple of moves. So black takes knight here is a blunder again. pawn takes. What happens after queen goes back to c7, for example, putting more pressure on c2? Well, a move like queen c7 will also be met by bishop b5, right? So this is, and the usual moves are coming. So after king d8, then knight d5, here same stuff. And black will find no escape after a move like queen check here, threatening the bishop because of knight c3. There's a discovered check and something like a mate in 5 moves. Here we are again after a move like knight e5 and queen d6. We played d4. Earlier we just went through knight c6, and well, that's a blunder. What happens after knight f6? The knight is applying more attack on the h5 square. Well, this is met also by bishop f4. The threat is to take the bishop in g6 as well. So let's look at a bit of a different move this time. What happens after queen to b6? In this case, the knight is in f6, protecting the weak d5 pawn that we've been targeting so much during this, so many different lines. And black is also not only defending the pawn in d5, but also going to take the pawn in b2, potentially. And also getting the queen out of the way of the bishop. Then again, bishop b5 check. Black can stop either with knight c6 or knight d7. What happens after knight c6? White plays g5. Right, this move is going to kick the knight away, and the black player will not be able to be defending the pawn anymore. After knight h5, though, attacking the bishop, white takes the bishop in g6, defending this bishop as well, so black will not be able to take the bishop in f4. So black takes back, and now white takes in d5, and everything's just fine with attacking the queen. And well, the queen cannot take the bishop because knight c7 wins the queen, and a move like queen check is simply met by c3. And again, the queen cannot take the bishop because of knight c7. And well, of course, removing the knight from this d5 square is not possible. So if knight takes bishop, then we just take this knight with check, pawn takes back, and then we can recapture the knight. So, right, going back a few moves. The other way to block it was knight to d7, but that's terrible because this knight is pinned and it's only defended by the knight, whereas in c6 the knight was defended by the pawn. So now after a move like g5 with attacking this knight, and we're winning a piece because the knight will have to move, then we'll be able to take here. If the knight doesn't move, we'll take it. So that's the worst move.